First of all, I think I'd just like to thank Isabel Whiteleg and Alex Farquharson for responding so instantly and generously to the idea that Eyal had of talking about his work at the exhibition, and it was a kind of instantaneous kind of response. And so here we are. We are the kind of the guests of Nottingham Contemporary. I'm very grateful. The idea today was it was Eyal's idea was that he's going to talk about his work, particularly the work in the Middle East. And then we thought we'd kind of have a discussion about the implications of this way of practicing architecture, which is kind of quite different from kind of, here's a site, let's put a shape on it. And I suppose that's why I kind of find this work so kind of interesting and exciting, because it has tremendous potential. I can see why kind of what I consider particularly young, thoughtful architects are kind of engaging with this kind of way of practicing and operating. So I think without more ado, over there is Eyal Weizman, who's going to talk to us about the work. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Tony. That's great. Obviously, happy to be here. Thank you for Isabel, for Alex. Tony is actually, just that you know, my nervousness in this lecture is because Tony is he's been involved in my own education. He's been a professor at the AA when I went there. So it almost feels like an end-of-year crit. So please forgive the kind of hesitation from time to time. I think I'd like to start with speaking about some aspects of the main installation that you see, that you saw, I hope, above, and lead out from there to kind of ideas. I know that lecture is called Arena of Speculations. The exhibition is called Common Assembly. Sort of idea of the relationship between spaces of assembly or spaces of presentation, where a certain political process takes place, and the kind of things that are presented within them. Also would lead out from a kind of an exploration of the idea of the common assembly to all sort of discussions around forensics, the art of the forum. But initially, just to show you that image that is existing in the exhibition, is in one of the stills in the videos, but is in fact the starting point of that exploration. The Palestinian Parliament building, a feature of the Oslo Accord, where Palestinians, the PLO turns into the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, moves back into the West Bank and Gaza, and in fact a extraterritorial project. Palestinian politics is very much based on that contradiction between a diasporic life of many of its the Palestinian polity is scattered, refugees in Israel, in the occupied territories, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in very many places. And the idea of political representation. How do you represent that which is scattered? You know, the politics is based on a kind of a unity between a political system, a kind of jurisdiction, sovereignty, and a single site of representation. House of Commons here, other places of parliament in other places. For Palestine, the idea of the parliament was always a parliament in exile. It was a site, I see your friends are coming from above. It was a site that had to be kind of reinvented. The rules of negotiation, the rules of discussion, the protocol has to be continuously reformulated as that kind of parliament would pop up in Cairo, in Amman, in Damascus, in Tripoli, in Beirut, etc. Right? It's kind of like a site, of assembly. People would fly in from all sorts of places, would assemble there, would invent the rules as they would go on, and that would kind of stand for a parliament. The minute that parliament had to be territorialized, had to land on the ground, be built, be solidified into a single architectural envelope, it was crushed. And here you see the power of this ephemeral territoriality that I think Tony was alluding to in relation to kind of the enormous, I would say, vulnerability of architecture. The minute it presents itself as a thing, as a target, right? The building was built on the edge, so people thought, of the borders of Jerusalem. Sorry, I don't know, is that a laser beam? Ah, yeah. Right, so these are the borders of Jerusalem, and the building is built as close as possible to the borders of Jerusalem. Israel forbade Palestinians to build in Jerusalem. They took the map, the border of Jerusalem, the area was nearest possible still controlled by the Palestinians, and the idea was to put the building right there on the line, demonstrating that they take part in the process, but they do not accept, in fact, this limitation, right? They want to be right there on the line itself. Well, as it happened, that period was very short, the Oslo period, the period of negotiation between Israel and Palestinian representative, was crushed under the weight and violence of the Second Intifada, under the weight and violence of internal Palestinian fractures between the Hamas and the PLO, and the building just ceased. It just stopped being built anymore. It was left as an empty carcass, as an empty shell, since the end of the 90s. It was somehow annexed to a university that was next to it, and from there we were asked to take that building as a starting point for speculating exactly around these points of politics, representation, space, and politics, if you like. The first thing we've done, in fact, given that, as you see, the lines of the border are very controversial, right? The whole area is, in fact, controlled by the Israeli military, so the very precise location of the line could never be fully determined. There's various lines of various periods, and as I would show you, the lines themselves have a thickness. The reason they have a thickness is due to the terms of the ceasefire that was agreed in 1949 between Moshe Dayan, and maybe you know this one-eyed famous Israeli general, and Abdallah, the head or the commander of the Arab Legion, the Jordan military. They meet on a hill in Jerusalem, and they basically draw a line of temporary ceasefire. Each one of them believe that the war will start very soon again, and that line is simply a kind of a moment of repose. They meet each other, and they put the map on the bonnet of Dayan's Jeep, right? The Jeep, the bonnet is warm because the engine was running, and it's dirty because it had all sorts of stones and dirt on it. They put the map on it, and with grease pencil they draw the line. That's a story told by an Israeli historian called Meron Ben-Venisti. And the line starts getting thicker and thinner as the grease on the pencil melt against the paper. Right? You see the very micro materiality of that situation created a situation by which the line itself has a thickness, sometimes 50 meters, sometimes a few meters, as the grease kind of smudges on it. We went, in fact, the first part of our project was to ask a Palestinian cartographer, in fact one of the best cartographers in the region, to draw with us again the line. Where is it? It's very, very abstract. And in fact, as he draws it, we discover that incredible abnormality or mystery or glitch or slippage. The line, in fact, was not at the edge of the building. The building was not pushed against the line, but the line ran through the center of the parliament. Because the line in that area had a thickness, and that thickness was that of a meter and so. That area within the building itself is an extraterritorial zone. It's a zone in which neither the law of occupation nor the law of the State of Israel fully operate. So the building, we thought, is in a fantastic kind of, awful but fantastic kind of situation. It contains within it Israeli territory, Palestinian territory, and extraterritorial one. And the extraterritorial one, we thought, is fantastic because it refers exactly to all those which are excluded from the polity. In fact, one of the main instruments of Israeli domination is always to separate Palestinians. Say, you vote for here, the Gaza parliament, you would vote for the West Bank parliament, you would vote for the Knesset, for the Israeli parliament, you would vote for Lebanon, etc., etc. It's a way of fragmenting the power, the political power of Palestinians, that we thought at least symbolically to unite again. As you know, the act of cleaning has been somehow redefined recently. Rescued from the world of hygiene and entered into the world of politics by exactly those people that were cleaning Tahrir Square, claiming it into a common ground, away from public space, public being the domain of the state, right? Into a common space by cleaning Tahrir Square. We decided to clean that part of the parliament that is the common, the thickness of the line itself, and created an architectural drawing in one-to-one through about 15 centimeters of bird shit that accumulated in the building. You can see that obviously in the film itself, creating that line that was also somehow reproduced within the exhibition. Some other parts of the exhibition follow that line through all the conditions of Palestine. We were saying also, you know what, both the Palestinian Authority, which collaborates with Israel, and Israel are kind of different ways of taking Palestine away. We want to think about Palestine as that which remain within the thickness of the line itself. And that thickness of the line goes through all the conditions that make Palestine, through olive groves and through gardens and through buildings and through kindergartens and through industrial zones, right? Connecting all those conditions. In a sense, we say, that in itself is precious to protect. The thickness of the line, that political zone of extraterritoriality, that is all that remain of Palestine. Okay, you've seen those pieces there, and from now on I would like to move into a different reflection of thinking the kind of the relationship between, say, architectural research or the way, or the question of how could, and this is a question I was dealing with throughout my professional life, because, let's say, at least as a job description, I'm an architectural critic, and I was thinking how architectural critique could have an effect in the world, right? Very simple question, no? Of course, we all know that exhibitions and publications and journals and books have their effect. But what drew me to forensics, and I'll speak about it later, is the seeking of the power of critique, right? And I thought the court, in fact, rather than saying, well, this architect did wrong or did ugly building, challenge it in court. Could architecture amount or could architects, which was part of my initial research, be actually liable for war crime violation, for human rights violation, right? It's not simply an offense against aesthetic, against beauty, but in that sense, not simply as participants in an illegal enterprise, but that architecture itself, the lines drawn on maps, right, are themselves, the way that they are drawn, are themselves a kind of a crime, connected to a crime. And that architectural representation, how can architectural representation start becoming evidence in court, right? Those two questions somehow haunted me, and I put them now in very simple terms. No, I mean, if you want it in a bit more nuanced way, you can. I invite you to read my publications. Okay, let's make a little break. The pyramids of Gaza. So a forensic architect once told me, proliferate in the Strip, mainly along the border to Egypt, and also around the refugee camps that ring Gaza City. They are the result of the meeting of two types of, two things which are very common to the Strip. A 3-story residential building of the kind that is very common as refugee habitat, and a D9 bulldozer, a Caterpillar bulldozer. As the bulldozer circles the building, the 3 stories building, it attacks, its short shovel can touch and attack only the peripheral columns of a building. The central column are left intact, and the building collapses around the crest, forming that kind of pyramidal structure. The pyramids of Gaza are not as regular as the pyramids of Giza. Their differences and their particularity register exactly the particularities of the battle or the form of destruction, or the laziness of the caterpillar operator to go fully around the building, or difference in the kind of the quality of concrete that was cast along the beams or the columns, etc. Right? It's exactly the irregularity that becomes the starting point of interrogation. Right? So these are, in fact, those kind of homes of refugees that I would return to at the end as the destruction of destruction. Homes of refugees, you do not just destroy simply a refugee habitat. What you destroy, a house of a refugee, is already a destruction. It is an indication of a displacement, of war, of the destruction of, and all that remains, in that case of Palestine of 48. The destruction of a refugee home is a destruction of that which has already been destroyed. Now, again, this is a very different set of images, before and after. Everything about forensics is a kind of presentation of before and after photography. In fact, I can tell you already, my next book is about before and after photographs from all form of disciplines. A kind of a short-circuiting, a stereoscopic time, but a short-circuiting of history. But this is simply one of the nuclear facilities or rocket facilities in Iran. Right? I mean, look at that. I think that architecture emerges again into our consciousness as an indicator of political processes. Of course, at the moment of its destruction, in its presentation of before and after, but also with the inability. There's something that happens here. It is not about witnesses, i.e. we cannot interview people in that factory or in Iran. The building replaces the witness as an indication of political process. Does that indicate that there was, non-conventional or rockets in the area? Does it indicate that this was blown up by the Americans, by the Mossad, by the MI5? That kind of contemporary archaeology of destruction becomes the mean in which decision of our vision of history and then decisions are undertaken. And now we have to understand something about the nature of spatial investigation. Unlike also the education that I got, where the relation to space is always tactile. It is always unmediated. In forensic architecture, you always deal with the representation of architecture through the media, and every media is different. And every media has its own politics. Whose satellite is it? What orbit does it travel? Who sells that image for how much, in what resolution, right? All those questions are, photographs from the ground. Now we deal a lot with activist videos as we are trying to harvest spatial kind of information, saturated. And I forgot to actually include that part in the presentation in activist videos. In order for something to qualify as forensics, and I think I mentioned initially that forensics is the art of the forum, we need to look at the origins of the term. Forensic comes from forensis in Latin, i.e. again, the art of the forum. It is not initially part of law, but it's part of the art of rhetorics. Rhetorics is about speech, but forensic does not include only the speech of humans, but rather the mediated speech of things. So for a forensic moment to occur, you need a relation, which will always be a shifting and dynamic relation between three things. A forum, and I showed you several forums, assemblies, etc. before. An object that is asked to speak, but because objects do not speak the language of humans, we need an interpreter, which then we used to call it, or Quintilian, one of the greatest rhetoricians of the Latin world, call it, for him, the translator from the language of object to the language of human is the rhetorician, and for us today is the expert witness, right, in court. All forensic moments and all controversies that I will show you are about that shifting relationship between a forum, an object, and a translator, right? This is just a basic kind of schema that becomes more and more and more and more complex. The forensic moment is not simply about the analysis of that aerial photograph, but about the presentation of that analysis, no? It's not only about the science, it's about the presentation of science to a forum. Therefore, all sorts of aesthetic categories enter into it. No? The theatricality, the presentation, the gestures, etc., that are part of the art of forensics. Not only the science, it stands between the scientific investigation and the very presentation of science within it. When you see that, you can think immediately of all sorts of moments where Colin Powell or others are actually affecting political decisions through the reading of things, something that Bruno Latour has unpacked in detail already. I think that the hinge that has brought forensics as an art, as a kind of started challenging human testimony, replacing it to a certain extent, has been in the presentation of human remains in court, and in particular, as this image shows you at the trial of the Argentinian junta in the middle of the 80s in Brazil. This is Clyde Snow, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, gravedigger of the 20th century, presenting a skull. But when he presents a skull in court, he always presents it as a witness rather than as an evidence. You know, an evidence is to be presented, a witness is interrogated. Witness and evidence exactly mark the difference between people and things, but forensics somehow blurs those distinctions again, somehow brings, treat things as if they were humans, and humans as if they were things, right? It operates in that kind of, the thickness of that line, if you like. How are we doing for time? Because I think we have plenty. Okay, so because I'm not. So this is the beginning of the reason that Tom Keenan and I have taken a particular investigation, historical investigation, the exhumation and identification of the skeleton thought and then confirmed to belong to a Nazi war criminal called Joseph Mengele. So the book is about Mengele's skull, and it comes, sometimes as an architect, you need to kind of take a detour, right? And we took this big detour for human remains and skulls in order to return to it. The reason is that around Mengele's skull has developed a technique that Clyde Snow, that great gravedigger, called osteobiography. Osteobiography, the biography of the bone, right? A transformation in the understanding of human remains, of the analysis of human remains, from simply identifying the moment of death, the method of killing, bullet shot to the head, or you think about all the awful things that people do to other people, to the way in which life process is fossilized or turns into materiality, shape, texture, and form, right? To identify a missing person, you do not need to identify the means or the moments or the time of the death. You need to reconstruct a complicated life, a system of migrations and labors and nutrition and medical history, as you can read them on the bone. So you read from materiality, from an object, you read time. Object becomes fossilized time in that context. And here, I'll really, this is really a very, very complicated kind of argument and long story on Mengele's skull that we kind of recreate in what we kind of call the trial of the bone, a process, a scientific peer review process that replaces somehow a kind of a trial of a person, but which allows the skull itself to become a historical hinge by which now a technique has been invented and skulls could enter kind of war crime investigation. And immediately everyone that was dug out in Argentina around the same time benefited from the technology and the science developed around Mengele's skull. So Mengele's skull allowed all those other skulls paradoxically to enter. And all the techniques, some of them hilarious, of skull face superimposition that were developed and somehow, capture that moment of subject, object, dead, alive, witness, evidence, that are kind of captured by this very, I think, powerful image of the skull and the face superimposed. And this is also a scientific image, which I find rather hilarious to see whether the Mengele's head fits Mengele's skull. That led to, when I went to interview the pathologist that invented this Clyde Snow, which I mentioned before, I'll cut a long story short. He sends us to Guatemala, where a lot of exhumations took place, but no architectural spatial analysis was actually undertaken. So here's the hinge. We are now in Guatemala City, in a laboratory called the Clyde Snow Laboratory, and the hinge between those two kind of stories occur. Around this man now, a much younger gravedigger called Freddie Pecciarelli, who runs that forensic anthropology center in Guatemala City. We go through the entire kind of process of exhumation, some of them from wells. These are dead bodies kept around that in this laboratory where they are identified and classified. Here you have a skull with a bullet. But our, let's say the transition was really from human remains to architecture. The problem was that in the massacres that occurred as a part of the last colonial massacres that happened at the end of the Cold War in the early 80s in Guatemala, about 400 or 400 to 600 Guatemalan Maya villages, indigenous villages, were destroyed in that process, and about 200,000 people were killed. The problem is the jungle very quickly grows over there, that most of the material with which those buildings were built was organic and disintegrated very, very fast. The jungle just accelerates all the processes of decomposition, etc. But nevertheless, we were kind of tracking through it and to find remnants and map them out in a way that connected, sort of, I don't know, the archaeology of the present with kind of forensic pathology in a certain way, where we kind of identified remains of villages. So I'm interested now a little bit more about the way in which, and this is kind of the way the project is going, moving into geology, what happens at that moment of not like the dead body that could be taken out as an object, named, presented as a kind of finite object, but exactly around the material flows that happen between the body and the landscape, between a building and the landscape. I mean, we often think of architecture as that which stands as an object on the landscape, but I'm interested in the forensics that always is engaged with a dimension of the disintegration, the destruction of architecture, a moment where you can see, when you don't know, are you looking at geology, archaeology, or architecture? Or in fact, you're looking at all three simultaneously, right? Those moments where human and non-human process work together, those moments where you do not see the edge, a clear edge of buildings or of objects, but the edge itself start disintegrating, where nature and building itself kind of start seeping into each other. This is one of those kind of moments of a topography. So this is another horrific model, in fact, that I've built. In looking for mass graves, people send now airplanes to create DTMs of the topography. They throw laser beam on the terrain and they map out the topography. They do it in order to identify moments where the normal way or the algorithmic way in which water moves on rocks and earth is disrupted, right? I mean, if there's an unnatural topographical feature, if there is an unnatural topographical feature, that is kind of the computer kind of comes up with notes it, and that start to be investigated. So you see sometimes 15 centimeter bump in the terrain, which is created when the soil that was put on a mass grave, so this is the edges of a mass grave, as it is, of course, the center kind of swells up, the edges of the mass grave kind of sagging, and you have the excess earth on the outside. So basically, simple kind of minute topographical variation leads you to that image or that model, which is a model of death, right? I mean, this is an image of mass killing, in fact, although you do not see anything within it. And that leads me back to connect to my earlier research and to that image that I called also in the lecture that I was giving here, based on Alex's invitation, the political plastic, right? I mean, Joseph Beuys once called art social plastic. And I insisted on calling architecture the political plastic, in a sense that that map of the West Bank, where you have Israeli settlements here in a spectrum of blue, built areas and the areas of their expansion, Palestinian built fabric, an area under their jurisdiction, continuously shift as the contours of political space continuously translate forced contradiction into the line of least resistance, right? So in a sense, the research started like an archaeology by investigating details in a form, small twists and turns of that form, as beginning of political processes, as well as indicators of that. We do not read it historically, we thought that history has been fossilized into a form, and we started by interrogating its detail and unpacking them. So that is the kind of the map of the political plastic. This is a work by Doris Salcedo at the Tate. I'm sure you know it. I had the fortune of writing on it and kind of thinking around the problem of cracks. And I started, at that moment, it did not yet connect to ideas that I have now, but for me, crack is exactly something that connects what is very important: geological force contradictions, urban and architectural one. The crack might start in a kind of minor geological fissure. It would move through the street. It would sometimes appear and disappear through the asphalt. It would enter a building into the column. It would run. Its path would always be the line of least resistance, no? The weakest part of the structure it would cut through. It would disappear. It would appear again in another material. It would jump from material to material as force contradictions are translated into other materialities and appear again. In fact, it's a diagram of the force field, the contradiction in the force field on its path, right? If you follow the path of cracks, they do not know what is being human-built or what is natural, what is geological, archaeological, architectural, or urban. They connected the crack through them. So that image is incredible, I think. And obviously, the more kind of obvious points of destruction. So I will end with a reflection on the war or the attack that Israel has unleashed on Gaza in 2009, to the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. In fact, 1,400 people were killed. Most of those people killed in Israeli bombardment on Gaza were killed within buildings. Out of those people, most were killed in their own homes. So we no longer can say the city is a site of violence, right? We could say architecture or the bits of buildings is what caused the death of people. People died by columns, by walls, by ceilings, by floors crashing onto them in high speed. At the moment the war is ended, the way the rubble settled immediately became an evidence because a lot of international juridical processes started. So who you see here is Judge Goldstone, the famous Goldstone Commission that went to Gaza to show or to seeking to demonstrate Israeli war crime and in fact crimes against humanity in their dealing with Gaza. And what you see here, in my opinion, is a perfect forensic moment. You have the microphone put in front of a building which is called to testify. But because the building does not speak or cannot speak, there is a translator, right, that kind of translates the object into the language of humans, and that is the kind of the forum, right? Those three elements that create a forensic moment are in fact all here. Goldstone relied on the work of one very, very able forensic analyst called Mark Garlasco, who was a Human Rights Watch expert on battle damage assessment. In fact, Garlasco was the guy who was walking through Gaza, and he is the guy that I said, a forensic analyst told me about the pyramids of Gaza. He told me about the pyramids of Gaza, right? So he is kind of like, he's a kind of NBA of architectural forensics. He kind of sees a building and he tells you exactly who came from what, where the tanks were, where the resistance was, where, he kind of reads it from the minute details in the form of the rubble itself. So it was incredibly surprising that on the same day that the Goldstone report was published, that Human Rights Watch fired, or in fact initially suspended, this man from their organization. The accusation was that Israeli bloggers have found that he was one of the biggest collectors in the US of Nazi-era memorabilia items. They accused him of being a Nazi fetishist. So without now kind of being too judgmental maybe about a hobby that perhaps some of us share, I would like to say that maybe that it was not the right kind of form of critique. In fact, I ran to, when the kind of the storm started to gather around Galasco, I went to see him in New York, and I said, what you need is somebody like me, an Israeli, that would say you're okay, from a human rights perspective. But I said, I'll do it on one condition, that I could say what I actually thought, that it is not in spite of your collection of Nazi paraphernalia that we should accept and believe in your forensic, it is because of it. That there is something of the fetish in forensics. And what else do we expect from the people that speak on behalf of things, that kind of look for the excess in objects, right? The translated speech that treat object as if they're subject and being themselves fetishes. So I thought that kind of that event somehow revealed the most extreme manifestation of forensic as a kind of methodological fetishism. And then I thought we need to redraw the meaning of fetishism based on that. If all of us that are educated in Marxist tradition still kind of think of the commodity fetish as that which hides, in fact, the means of production, right? The commodity and our attraction to the commodity hides the fact, the violence, and the relation of exploitation that went into the making of the object. That's a traditional Marxist thinking of the fetish. I thought that the fetish is the way into the world of objects, right? Diving into their objectivity and kind of becoming one with them, which is absolutely essential for forensic in the most extreme of its own manifestation. Here is an example of that contradiction. Galasco is a human rights guy. Human rights people go into sites of conflict and take picture of people. Usually those people are victims. Usually they are children, women, or old people. People that are not conceived to have any political or military capacity, although it is obviously wrong. Galasco goes to Gaza, he takes that picture of this lady standing incredibly steadfast in front of the ruin of her own home. But when he narrates that image, and don't, disregard the salute here, it's not intentional. But look at it again, right? When he narrates that image, the last thing he's interested in is the lady itself. What he's looking at is exactly the trash and rubble left behind, through which he reads the detail of the battle. That is the shift between the subject and the object that forensic occurred. This is kind of the moment of the fetish that is so horrific, yet so inspiring in its kind of manifestation, its most radical manifestation. Forensics speaks also the language of perpetration, the language of evil. The closeness to the logic of perpetration is incredibly important. The intimacy with those objects, right, is what is somehow kind of inspiring. How are we doing with time? I don't have another story. We're done, yeah? Okay, the story of Galasco, I will just end on that kind of horrific level. It was himself, when I started to speak to him, I asked him, so how come Human Rights Watch does not know about your Nazi collection before? I mean, you publish books. It's out on the web. He said, well, they knew much worse. They knew that I was involved in a killing of about 250 civilians in Iraq. And indeed, the story that became apparent from that moment was that Galasco, prior to be working as a forensic architect for Human Rights Watch, was the Pentagon's expert on targeting. And in the run-up to the Iraqi war of 2003, where under the kind of the camouflage of the shock and awe, he was there to design the killing of the 10 top Ba'athist leaders in Iraq, the political leadership, Saddam Hussein, Hassan Majid, the sons, etc., etc. The problem he had to design, he was an expert on targeting, he had to design their killing from the air. Each one of those killing each one of those people were actually residing in multi-story buildings, civilian buildings, seeking to protect themselves around civilians. His order from the Pentagon, from Rumsfeld at the time, was to limit every bombing so that it would kill the person he wants to kill, and no more than 29 civilians, right? A threshold was drawn. 29 civilian would be accepted casualty. The illegal killing would start at 30, the 30th civilian. In order to undertake that task, Galasco had to study something of architecture. He had to understand how buildings stand, right? How much concrete are in their columns, how much concrete are in their beams, how much glass is in the envelope. He had to understand something about urbanism, how many people would be in a building in any particular time of the day, right? So that, he could start his new art of killing as that which is called the design of ruins, right? If there would be no threshold, as there wasn't previously, he could just drop a 2-ton bomb and flatten the entire building. The minute a threshold was done, as horrific as it is, 29 civilian, he had to start specializing in removing building parts, top floors, that wing rather than that wing, etc. Civilian killed, but he never kills any of the Ba'athist leaders he was asked to. The war ends in April, or the first war ends in April. No, the Bush flight to the aircraft carrier takes place in April. Galasco resigns from the Pentagon and finds job with Human Rights Watch. Immediately they grab him. This is what they wanted, an expert on battle damage assessment. They give him a very quick course in Human Rights Watch and send him to Iraq for the first time. He's in Iraq at the end of 2003, this time as a human rights analyst. He knows exactly where to look for the ruins because he's put the targets together. And bizarrely, he is writing a report on his own deeds. He stands in front of the buildings that he has left, that he planned their destruction. He has the image of them from above and he's looking at them from ground level. And at that moment, the art of design of ruin, or the targeted killing, turns into forensic architecture, right? Forward and backward. It is, although many people at the time wrote about his work as through the kind of the genre of redemption story, this kind of Catholic genre by which the saint could only be a saint as he has been a sinner. She has been a sinner, right? There's a direct relationship between sin and salvation. That's the redemption story, no? Galasco has moved from being a killer at the Pentagon to Human Rights Watch. In fact, are part of the very same logic by which human rights become really the means of perpetuating and perpetrating violence today. And therefore, I think the right genre for this, and also for understanding forensics in all its potential and horrors, is not that of the redemption story, but that of the noir, in which it is only the criminal that can solve the crime. Thank you very much.
So, if any of you want to interject in some kind of way, some fairly ruly way, please do at any time, as it were. But I'm interested very much in this idea of how the evidence transforms to become the witness, which is a kind of is a very powerful. It's that and the idea of the rhetorical becoming the metaphor, and how you keep these things apart in order to be clear about how you're being precise in your research, as it were.
So, I mean, you go to the help of Quintilian, who says that to refute a forensic statement, and in fact, all of my, what you would see now if we would have another 2 hours is a sequence of narratives, one weirder than the other, where forensic evidence kind of transforms on the hinge between subject and object, opens up architecture, or kind of transform political reading of situations. He says that in order to refute a forensic statement, you need to dismantle that triangle. You either say the object is inauthentic, you say the expert is lying, or you say the expert does not speak the language of the object. And into that kind of almost kind of mechanical image of interruption, you can see each one of those cases. So, for example, in Garlasco case, it never said the object is inauthentic. This is the ruin of Gaza. It was clear to all. It's clear to all also who did it. It is the translator is biased line that was kind of introduced in order to disrupt it. But you see, I have to kind of insist also that the forums of forensics are never pre-given. And it would be a mistake to see them as existing architectural building, although that would be the easiest tendency. The forum assembles around the destruction or the object that is made to think. This object calls forth a forum, right? The forum could be political, could be professional, could be juridical. The forum is a new form of political association. It's a new political community, if you like, that is organized around a question. But forums are expanding and contracting, no? They are networks to each other. Sometimes they burst, no? Sometimes they join together. They're very kind of complicated constructions. Therefore, the art of forensic architecture is not only looking at the past, at what has happened, but it's about inventing new forms to come. Look at that in this way. In the Yugoslav war, genocide claims started to be articulated very early on, 91, 92, right? The ICTY goes into operation. So first we have the violation. First we have the mass grave. First we have the skulls. Then ICTY, the International Tribunal for Judging Former Yugoslavia, assemble around them, right? It is not like in criminal law, no? You have the fixed kind of forums, and then into which you have the objects that enters, right? You have the object or the event inventing new forms, some of them rather utopian form, like international justice. However, we're critical of it. The idea that there could be a mechanism of international justice above and beyond the state is a utopian idea. It's a juridical utopia, right? And of course, it only operates in relation to weak states. So we know its limitation, but still we need to understand the premise of that. These things are very, very fragile and very elastic, those forums that are connected. So initially, the idea of the forum precedes its solidification in architectural form, right? I.e. the building of the court building itself. The forum is a kind of a conceptual political space that comes around the problem of the translated enunciation of objects, right?
Can I ask you a question about architectural agency? Because it seems to me that, beginning with Hollow Land and looking at your work with decolonizing architecture, that, your focus is not on an architectural auteur in any sense, which I imagine is the mainstay of architectural education, but instead agency with regards to structures lies in all kinds of other domains. Whether it's politicians or military figures or human rights figures or lawyers, etc., etc. And this seems to me one of the kind of fascinating aspects of your analysis of the structures, the infrastructure, the landscape of Palestine and Israel. Yeah. So could you talk about kind of architectural authorship in those terms, perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, when you have it's a great question, because when you say the political plastic, right, when you say it is forced contradiction solidifying into form, you would say, some of those, imagine a very mechanical example. Imagine a kind of a very strong force field into which you throw a drop of honey, right? A drop of honey will be pulled and pushed, right? and would create a kind of a blob whose contours would register exactly the momentary balance of forces that holds it together in a particular form, right? You would say these forces are formative forces, right? And if you like, you can say the force field is the architect, or the making of the architecture. Of course, this is a very, referring to your work, Foucauldian understanding of a relationship between force and form, or a relationship between force and force fields, etc., right? So there's something that happens there. I think something that is beyond that. Okay, so let's say we understand it's rather mechanical. If we understand that, we understand two very important things about architecture. We say architecture is simultaneously a sensor and an agent, right? It is a sensor because, you look at it and you can read back the political forces. I'll give you another much more easy to understand example. You look at a building, you look at the first few millimeters of a plastered facade, right? You look at the air bubbles under that facade. You look at the cracks, little minor cracks in that facade, right? You say that's a sensor of the changing environmental forces on that building, of the salination, on the change in CO2 in the air, of environmental regulation, of transformation of temperature, which are themselves political because they have been, through global warming, blah, 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 right? You said that's a sensor. But architecture is also an agent by itself, right? So gradually I come to resist the understanding that the materiality is simply a kind of a receptacle of forces. And I'm asking about the agency of architecture itself, right? So you're talking about the force field solidifying into form, ossifying into form, becoming osteobiography or building biography, etc. But what resistance exists in the material itself, right? When it is not the agency, a diffused agency of architect, but the agency of the thing, right? And I think that this is very, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities. But you have to go through the fetish. It doesn't work if it's just, that's the door.
But is the fetish the kind of almost a subjective kind of intervention in this process, as it were? So that I'm interested in the kind of almost this. Yeah, I love the words forensic architecture and the idea of architecture as research rather than research as architecture, as it were.
Yeah.
How do you actually because there are suggestions you want to be propositional. In fact, some of those projects upstairs are quite propositional. And that area between your idea of the agency or the observational quality or an understanding of the work and the propositional kind of idea of the work, and how you actually keep that tension going in order for it not to become a kind of sloshy, metaphorical kind of world, as it were.
Initially, I think it's a very, very important point again. So initially, I would say the world of architecture, is a very complicated word, but let's kind of simplify. It was divided into formalists and socialists. No, it's just a stupid division. But there was those at the AA, who was kind of like doing form, etc., and there were those who kind of like concerned about social problem and thinking that. Kind of maybe over-reading Lefebvre and Descartes, reading them in bad ways, and kind of imagining that it doesn't matter how space look like or what it is or what material it is, it's matter what happens inside. I think both cases got it wrong. No? I mean, I think that in a sense there is no politics of space, there's no sociability that is not materially motivated or spatially motivated, no? That intervention in politics is always matter in movement. Politics is always material moving, either fast at the speed, almost close to the speed of sound, as a bit of your column from the house flies at you, or very slow, in a kind of slow encroachment and transformation of contours of political space, as some other of the examples I would have showed you, and I didn't have time to, right? But, so that is something that is kind of important, and therefore, we need to, when you say fetish, we think, oh, you just fetishize, like a whole lot of kind of derogatory kind of barrage of things falls at you and thrown at you. But if you allow the object itself to participate, right, if you give an object powers that is beyond the human powers to affect it, you open politics on a different level, right? So we had a discussion about the parliament of things. So Latour is kind of like both a teacher and an enemy in this kind of research, right? Not enemy, but kind of one has to distance oneself from a very pacified relation that kind of sort of a liberalism of objects that he opens. But there is absolutely kind of the contribution, the massive contribution is there in a kind of understanding of politics and the relation of politics and things, etc. So I'm indebted and reserve kind of distance from it simultaneously. But in relation to intervention, intervention for me, the intervention, the only meaningful way to speak about intervention in a political, right? So one may need to build or destroy something or propose a pergola or house or a multi-story building, whatever. Or one might mobilize architecture to generate its political effect through the research and its presentation. So, it is that kind of intervention through architecture, not with it's never simply ends with the architectural forms, right? I would like to mobilize architectural form as a way of intervening in political social issues, right? So that is, I guess, and sometimes you say, well, like creating or inventing a new forum or proposing a new forum or proposing, like in the Common Assembly, what is it if not a proposition of a kind of a forum that would include simultaneously Palestinian under Israeli domination, Palestinian collaboration or extraterritorial, right? You invent a new forum that didn't exist. So that is architecture.
And it seems to me that you see the most potential, particularly with regards to decolonizing architecture, in situations of negativity, i.e. voids, situations of ruination, of abandoned structures, that kind of thing. Is this to do with the fact that one's dealing with a political landscape that is otherwise, hyper politically articulated, and therefore the spaces, the sites for resistance, for alternative, for potential, have to begin with voids, have to begin with ruins of various kinds. Lawlessness, hence these prefixes and suffixes of un and less and so on.
It doesn't take much imagination to see virtually the whole world like this, does it, really?
Sure, and we can expand on that, but it seems like, ISPAL is a particularly kind of concentrated, laboratory, and obviously, highly like a disastrous one in many aspects in this.
Well, I think that when one understands the formation of matter, form making, is always a result of conflicting forces. One does not make a distinction between so-called peaceful urban situation and very, very extreme ones. One would say the extreme one is simply accelerated form of conflict that happens in a city anyway. There is no urbanism, there's no understanding of the city without understanding of conflict. Cities are a kind of containers of continuous radical conflict that form and reform matter within it, right? So whether they are between bankers and occupiers, or whether they are between whatever communities and developers, or between all and all, it's a kind of a fight of all and all. So so going into an area where the forces are visible in the most extreme and brute kind of way is a kind of okay. You can start in a clear fashion. Another thing that happens is that the possibility of disaster opens up the possibility of the common, right? I.e. a kind of the disruption that disaster afflicts on a certain space, kind of suspends normal behavior, suspends normal system of rule, jurisdiction, sovereignty, etc. Now create a kind of a vacuum that could become the common, right? So sometimes these are the kind of this exactly, you go into the cracks, right? In that sense.
Somebody here who's going to join in. Wonderful.
I just want to come back again to this relationship.
Could you shout?
Sorry. I just want to come back to this.
Ah, wonderful.
I just wanted to come back to this relationship between the object and the translator. And when you say that the translator basically has to approach the object through the form of fetishizing it, or a fetishist relationship. But I think your whole arguments, and I think everything was really very interesting. But I think then we really have to start with the politics of the fetish, because I think the fetish is not it's not a neutral ground. There are certain politics and interests as well, and I think this is then, I think this is where another form of conflict can arise, or where we have to be aware that there can also be a form of manipulation, I think. Or this is
I fully agree with you, Nadine. It's in this lecture it was kind of shorthand, but to answer your question, there's a whole, you need a whole new kind of resolution in entering in kind of differentiating between different kind of fetishes, between a kind of an object and materiality. And this is exactly where my research is going and why I'm so interested in geology, because there's a kind of objectlessness of the material flow when you look at the earth itself. And the earth, again, it containing, foundations of building, depositories of waste. It contains natural strata and rock formation and calcium of dead bodies and all sorts of things, where the borders of the thing are not easily marked out. They're not objects anymore, right? They're material flows. So the idea of the agency of that, or the idea of fetishizing that, becomes very different than fetishizing this, or fetishizing a skull, or being that kind of Hamlet or whatever, in these situations. So
different fetishes develop different fetishes to the same object there. And this means that this particular object can also speak different languages, or can prove different things within the court, because also it's not about truth or false. It is, it's always this matter of negotiation.
Yes.
But that, for me, is the interesting kind of point of how one finds some kind of way of operating, as it were, because it seems to me that this kind of way of kind of imagining, particularly this idea of how materiality becomes witness as opposed to evidence, I think is a kind of a very kind of potent kind of way of seeing certain kinds of conditions, both physical, political, cultural, as it were.
Could lie. If it's a witness, it could lie.
Sure, but surely this is where this notion of the fetish as some kind of almost subjective clarity, a kind of clarity that you can bring to a set of conditions, because it seems to me that's kind of what forensic architecture sounds to me, as if one is actually trying to actually find out what really is going on there.
Absolutely.
What the hell is going on, in order that one can actually start to make some.
Could I ask what might be a related question? I want to shift the ground to London. And to the DTI building outside Victoria Station.
DTI?
The Department of Trade and Industry, which is quite new, but earlier than 9/11, yet was carefully specified to be blast resistant.
Yeah, sure.
What is your view of that approach to architecture?
I think they're very bad neighbors, because If somebody wants to blow it and would see that's blast resistant, we'll just go to the next building. I think there's no point in, on a very pragmatic level, no? Differential protection. You just create vulnerabilities. Create enormous vulnerabilities of exactly those things which are most vulnerable. And finally, homes. So, those kind of over-fortification, if you look at the American cities of federal buildings, less fortification of state buildings, and no fortification, basically create a situation of exposure of things. I could endlessly speak about the stupidity of fortification anyway, But that is one issue.
But taking that in a different direction, there's a fascinating piece of British propaganda from Coventry in the Second World War, where a wooden signal box is blown up and 4 men are just playing cards. They're not really doing anything productive. They all survive because the architecture is so vulnerable. Would you actually advocate use of something other than concrete?
Yeah. I really love concrete as an architect. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, it's a very interesting kind of field of interrogation, whether, and I think what you point at is interesting, that the more ephemeral the building is, the more, not resistant, but the more it would protect the people living there. I think it's got a lot of merit, this argument, in fact. Yeah, it's like building in LA, no? I mean, you don't, right? I mean, we've just been there, and you see those amazing case study houses, and they are sitting on a fault line, basically, and they're like made of cardboard. They're made of nothing. It's like, they're so vulnerable, they're so fragile, they're so beautiful at that. Rather than trying to fight the earthquake by ever fortifying making the structure more and more and more solid, the crack will find you, man.
I was about to say your description of the crack kind of talks very much about that kind of sensibility of kind of thinking about inhabitation, as it were. So, and in fact, this whole kind of the idea of just even, in fact, investigating the thickness of a 1 to 20,000 line or whatever it was blown up, and all of a sudden we find this kind of vulnerable kind of space that kind of becomes, in fact, through its vulnerability, it becomes a powerful instrument, as it were.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is what the crack. I mean, it would be amazing, to do an architectural survey of cracks, in a building, if I had the patience. I don't know, I'm too nervous to do that, but if I had the patience to catalog, a building with all its cracks and kind of draw the line of force and how those cracks, they're amazing, they start somewhere, they disappear for meters, and then they would appear somewhere else, it's magic.
But just pushing this idea about transposing, particularly your kind of research and kind of descriptions of the sort of specific Middle Eastern kind of conditions, to actually thinking about kind of architectural practice in other contemporary conditions, as it were.
Yeah.
London, Nottingham.
Yeah.
I'm sure you must. It seems to me part of the institute's kind of work must be thinking about these, about actually becoming instrumental in those kind of areas.
Well, I mean the challenge is always site specific and kind of interested. I'm very interested to. In building, in architectural practice like that. I'm just thinking of it, my framework of thinking architecture and where it effect lies a little off-center from that. But I think that Yeah, I mean, many problems in London, in Nottingham, etc., need to start, or could start, from that kind of idea of architecture is a sensor and an agent, right? It's stupid, no? Those two things, it's a sensor, right? What just like you have all sort of like Petri glasses, no? Where you kind of see, it's a sensor. How close can you look at it? What politics can you see in the first millimeter of an of a cladding, of a facade, right? What politics can you see in the dirt that you can take from the side of a window, or what politics you see in the very layout of cities, bridges, and the contours of towns and neighborhoods, right? It's the same problem. It's not different. It's a kind of the way in which material, formative forces solidify into form. No, I mean it could be on every scale. And then kind of think of that as an agent. Think of architecture as your equal, right? Not as something that you've made. Think of it, this is what the kind of the fetish is, no? I mean, the sense that you give it agency, no? Fetishes are, what are the moments where you take clay, no? I mean, let's say you are not monotheistic. How they call it today, Judeo-Christian thing, no? Just say it. I hate this term because it's obviously it's not non-Muslim. No, you don't say Judeo-Muslim Christian, right? Did you? But anyway, let's say you're not a monotheist and you're some kind of fetishist, paganist of some sort, and so you start making something in your own hand, and at some point you make it, and at some point you're not its master; it becomes your master, right? That's an interesting point. That's the point where Galasco, when it changes, the killing into the forensics. No, that's moment. How does it happen?
How about the kind of mythological and ideological uses of these apparently empirical techniques?
Yeah.
So thinking of forensics, but maybe also thinking of archaeology. I think that's particularly the case in Israel and Palestine, where there are these layers of inhabitation. And different layers are kind of privileged, some are wiped out, and they're made to speak. So we're back to your image of witness. How do you negotiate that, in a way, a prior mythification of these, technologies you're using?
I think that the problem of the mythification of biblical archaeology is that it just did that, it just kind of said, whatever, we go down 13 meters or so, up to the level of the Bronze Age, which is the biblical time. Everything above is rubble, we just grind it. The Mamluk period, the Ottoman period, right? All this is crap, we just do roads with it, and we kind of like, and we take the biblical level and prioritize it. But I think that my approach is not about doing that, it's about saying, let's do the archaeology of the asphalt surface as if it is as important as the Second Temple period, right?
Definitely, that's the reading. I work at Nottingham University with 6 other people in our studio, and I know that they're here tonight, and I know that they're thinking, their minds are whizzing away and translating this kind of sensibility and this kind of it's somewhere between a kind of it's jolly nice. Somewhere between a very sophisticated technical kind of technique, as it were, and this idea of metaphor, as it were. These two things working together, so that certainly the value of this twisted. When you showed your model of the burial ground, and you described quite clearly the kind of the kind of implications of how the ply crust kind of dropped at the edges, as it were, where the earth had been, and then the spill of the extra earth that was left over that this kind of readings, these kind of forensic readings, kind of, to my mind, build up a very powerful way of imagining the possibilities of a project.
Yeah. absolutely. I think the only thing that I think we agree on everything. I think the minor point of disagreement that we have is that I wouldn't say that the metaphor is at play.
No, that's why I used it. It's not. It's not a word that I like to use too much, but I used it very provocatively.
Yeah, of course.
To antagonize the kind of the astringency of the observation, because without that astringency, it becomes
exactly.
Sorry, I'm really scared of using this. I just wondered what you thought of speech and how that fits into your work. You mentioned the enunciation of architecture, and I just wondered how you felt about kind of the locus of speech and the primacy of it, and if being close to, particularly because you spoke about rhetoric, being close to kind of the centre of speech and how that's been prioritised, particularly in philosophy. I guess I'm thinking of a Derridian approach. What would your thoughts be on that?
I mean, the place maybe you want to start, if this is a kind of a question to you, is in Benjamin's essay on translation, on the speech of things. No, that's kind of those three layers of work. Also, there is more accessible version of that is the discussion of Hito Steyer on that article, which you can find online. Exactly on kind of the difference between speech of human or something that comes out of bodily, I change my mouth, I push air through it, different sounds come, etc. And the communicative capacity of things. And I think anything that kind of emanates a certain communicativity is part of a world of speech and speech acts.
I think I was thinking more because you're dealing with kind of the palimpsest, in that can you ever get back to the kind of the genesis of the form, and how does that connect
the
to
genesis
speech?
of
origin of the form.
Yeah.
Form.
The origin of the structure of form. What's at the bottom?
I'm not sure I follow.
Can you get to the bottom?
To the bottom of things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I follow.
I'm not sure I do. Just because you spoke about forum and witness.
Oh, the genesis of the forum or the form.
No, not really. But because you speak about truth and witness and the object, how does that connect to being so far removed from kind of the voice and the speech? So speech in a philosophical sense, as in the original voice.
Right. So I would say that there is something. Okay, let's start with a quote that Clyde Snow actually attributed to the speech of the skull. He says, "Bones make great witnesses. They speak softly, but they never lie." Oh, sorry, he says two things. They never forget and they never lie. Right? Bones make great witnesses, right? Bones are not objects, they are witnesses. They speak softly, i.e. you need to be tuned. You need to kind of, to really hear that kind of whisper of them. But then he ends up and he says they never forget and they never lie, which is weird, no? Because, so there's an assumption that people may lie and that things do not lie. That the difference between object and subject is exactly that, no? That a subject could present the world from her point of view, narrate event to fit her, kind of, interest, etc., perspective. But the thing would not do it, no? So, in granting the object a bit of the characteristic of the subject, we turn it also into a super subject, no? It is the only subject that doesn't lie. And don't forget, we all forget and lie, no? Somehow. And then you have but then I wanted to take this thing to task, to understand why he would say that. And obviously, no, he says it because he's an expert witness, no? So if you're an expert, you would say, well, my witness never lies. Yours lies, no? And he is the kind of the representative of things. So he's, every good lawyer would do that. No, it's like, my witness doesn't lie. So that's all, right? That is happening within that kind of moment of enunciation. And then you understand that it is not as if to lie is complicated to invent. This is the kind of and to say the truth is easy. The truth is simply lying there fossilized in the object. It's rather the contrary. To articulate truth, i.e., to convince, to create conviction, you need all sorts of technologies. You need all sorts of aesthetic techniques. You need all sorts of means of enunciation, all the gesture and theatricality that I was speaking about before, in order to create facts that have effect in the world, right? To create facts that are created, If you take, Laurent Daston kind of articulation of the facts come from things that are fait, that are made. So you understand that the kind of the creation, in order for things to speak, you need between them and the forum such a thick, it's not simply a kind of a person that translates. It's a layer of technologies, of means of projection and display. It's all sort of, it's the thickness of culture, that is there between the forum and the object. So as a shorthand, it is a translator. But actually, it is, the translator herself has all sort of means at her disposal, right, to do it. Starting from a data projector to a light beam on an object, to the texture of colors, etc.
But I like the idea of this translator working within and kind of almost a kind of a tussle between this thickness of the culture. I was thinking, as you were talking about objects or materiality not lying, and you talk very much about the idea of the fetishist and the rhetorist, and in a way they're the same. They're the same person, as it were. That the translator, in fact, that actually brings a particular set of cultural and physical kind of conditions, and gives them a particular kind of form, as it were, at the level of observation, not at the level of making, as it were, just at the level of observing and pulling something apart, and that kind of balance and that tension between the two things, which is kind of to find some kind of clarity particularly as an architect, to actually find what is this project? What is this? What am I actually looking at? What am I dealing with, as it were? How do I get through it? You wanted to say something.
And when we go back again to the forum, and we have the objects, and we have the translator speaking for the objects, basically articulating the language of forensics. And are there other agents that you would like to see in this forum? Because I think the forensics, they can speak about certain things, but they cannot speak about everything. And I think this is also what Hitu probably did in your exhibition. She added something that maybe forensic might not be able. I mean, forensics can speak about that. They can kind of create this three-dimensional image, but then a kiss or like emotions. This is something that. How would this? Do you think that it's possible to include these aspects into the language of forensics, or do you think there need to be other agents in this forum that take on the voice for these aspects to recreate or to reflect on a specific situation or on a historical event?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is where I disagree with Hitu. So a forum is in itself continuously transforming in relation to the kind of the needs of the language that is articulated in it. There is nothing like a stable forum that is just fixed, that hears or cannot hear something. The very enunciation continues to transform the sensibilities of the forum. And there were things that were not seen, were not heard, were not visible before, become visible through an expansion of the forum, for example. So that's exact case where very clearly you see in the introduction of the skull of Liliana Pereira by Clyde Snow into the Argentinian junta, the first skull to enter as a witness in an international criminal to international law trial or human rights trial, transformed everything around it, transformed the definition of witness, of evidence, of speech, right, of the forum. That is what, there's been something aesthetic that happens. That's the moment of the forensic aesthetics that we talk about, where it's not simply, you're seeing something you could have seen before. Something enters into the visual field and transforms it.
Definitely, but the skull, for example, couldn't talk about how maybe Mengele felt when he died or when he committed these crimes or these things.
Yeah, okay.
So this is like, so the forensics definitely, they shift our perspective, and every time when a new agent enters the forum, the whole how would you say, trial changes.
Yeah.
But and forensic, I think, is a very interesting, probably overseen agent in this trial.
Okay, I think I understand now what you say. And also, let's say that would be another point of contention, let's say, with the model of the Parliament of things that Latour has. No, any form of assembly, right, that creates collectivity has an edge condition to it. It filters, right? It filters who can come in and who cannot come in, who is part of the discussion, what criteria are included and what are excluded. No. Sometimes it could be transformed. Sometimes the forum can expand, but it will always have an edge condition to it. So in various situations that I show, like even trial in human rights law affirm and are based on human rights law, which is itself, has a kind of a historical sedimentation of state power and state interest and imperialism that is, built into it. So each one of those things is less than perfect, but they are dynamic, right? They could be transformed. So, whereas the very nature, the very fact conversation would happen would be, that kind of idea of inclusion, within a sort of a parliament of things, have not thought its edge, right? And this is where I think that you're absolutely right, that each one of those institutions is completely entrapped within a specific historical situation, historical political situation that define what is possible within it and what is not.
I think we're going to have to draw this to a conclusion, only that Eyal has to get back to London, get a train, and then I know that he wants a drink as well. So perhaps we can continue the conversation in the bar across the way. Right. Many thanks, Alex, and particularly to